Hello, everyone. We are very lucky to be joined today by the British and Tanzanian novelist, Professor Abdulrazak Gurnah. Professor Gurnah was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2021, the latest among a host of prizes he has received over his career, with novels like Desertion in the 2000s, Paradise in the 90s, and most recently, in his first book since receiving the Nobel, Theft, which we are going to discuss today. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Gurnah. The first thing that I'd like to ask you about this book is this is a book that is set in Zanzibar, in the immediate aftermath of the monarchy leaving Zanzibar. Uh, the first thing which I wanted to ask you was, so many of your earlier novels have focused on migrants from this part of the world and their integration efforts into the West. And this is a sort of converse scenario. So is this something that you had been working towards from the beginning of your career? Or is this something that you decided to take up more recently?
Hi. No, it's not something new. In fact, if some of the earlier books have also been about Zanzibar or about the coast, including my first book, including Paradise, as you mentioned. So it's not a new subject, as it were. Uh, and it isn't immediately. I mean, it covers a longer period than the period immediately after the revolution. It starts before, covers the period of the independence period and the more or less contemporary, the 2000s, I guess. So it covers a period of about 30 years or so.
Right, right. The central trio of characters in the novel, Kareem, Fawzia, and Badr, these are very different people when you look at the class stratification aspect of it. Badr was a domestic help in the house of Kareem's mother, and then a misunderstanding occurs because of which these three people are brought together and so on. So what I wanted to ask you is the class angle, which is such an important factor in the way these three characters' trajectories play out. Is the class factor especially heightened when we are talking about places or countries that have recently undergone or are undergoing sort of regime change?
Uh, no, well, class differences are important wherever, but I mean, it isn't exactly class in the sense that, shall we say, more capitalized, more developed in a capital sense, society would experience class difference. These are um, more old-fashioned in a way. This is between those who have power and those who don't. Uh, so the reason that one is a servant and the other is a student is precisely because the one who's a servant has no choices, has no power, has no support, has no family, etc. So the only way in which it's possible for him to make a living is to be subservient. The other one has opportunities, has life is waiting to happen for him. Um, so of course these are dimensions of difference in conditions, in resources, in money, or simply in kind of the lack of having family and support. They're not, I would have said or thought, they are not kind of endemic in the way that class differences, let's say in Europe or in the UK, are, so that you are born into a class. And unless you do something extraordinary, that's where you stay. And that's the kind of work you'll do, those are the kind of schools you'll go to, etc. It isn't like that. These are people who have been dealt a certain life by circumstances and by events. And what is interesting to me in the novel is how do they deal with what life has dealt to them.
Right. Um, you know, when we see Kareem working as part of a green development project that is backed by the European Union, we see the attitudes, especially some of the older people around him. And there is this palpable sense of distrust, not just because of the European involvement, but also because of the very conceptual, like the very concept of an environmental movement backed by the West. Right. So I wanted you to tell me a little bit about the historical background around this. Why is there such a clear sort of generational gap between, in the sense that the younger people seem to be much more on board with this, while the older people have this unshakable sort of sense of distrust around the whole venture.
Yes, it's familiarity will be part of it. That for the older generation, we would have had very little contact with either tourists or with NGOs. This would have been something unknown to them. I remember when the tourist business started in Zanzibar, which is not that long ago. It was sort of mid-80s, I suppose, something like that. Before that, the idea of a tourist would be somebody who's the ship stopping, a liner that's going from South Africa to somewhere, and will stop for a day. The passengers would come down and walk around the streets, and that's it. That's tourist over. Then they go back and they have their meal. But the idea of people coming and spending 2 weeks or something and so on was only really started in the 1980s. And I remember a story, a friend of my mother's telling me the story of she was watching this young man with a backpack, and he seemed lost, and he was dressed in rags. And she thought, "Oh, poor boy, he's probably in." So she went out to him. She didn't speak in English. She went out to him and she said, "Are you all right? Can I give you some money to go and buy yourself a cup of tea or something like that?" And I thought, this woman doesn't understand that young ragamuffin boy has got a bit of plastic in his pocket, which can probably buy her house, let alone buy a cup of tea. So it's lack of familiarity of what these people are coming from and what they're bringing and why do we need them. And so the suspicion comes from that. Who are they? Why are they here? Why are they disrupting our lives? Whereas for younger people, it may be something that is attractive because of its newness, or because it brings news from the bigger world, or indeed because it's smart, it's attractive.
Right. And in that vein, there's very interesting moment when I believe it's Fauzia's mother, who when Fauziya says this about Geraldine, who's a white character, a very important character in the book, she corrects her mother when she says, "Oh, she's a tourist," and then Fauziya says, "No, she's a volunteer. There's a difference." And then the mother reacts saying, "Well, what's the difference?" So, if you could tell me a little bit about that moment and how that came about.
Sure, but that's a moment without revealing anything. It's a very dramatic moment. It's a moment of what she says in a rage, the mother, I mean,
Right.
because of the kind of disruption, I suppose, that the presence of this young NGO has caused to their lives. Excuse me. But I guess there is a general way. So the response is possibly not unusual. That kind of feeling of anger at what this is happening, because because tourism, particularly for a small place like Zanzibar, is a mixed phenomenon. In a big or rich country like here, like the UK, tourism means something completely different. Everything is under control. People come here, they pay through the nose, they behave themselves, etc., etc. Uh, in a small place, because of the inequality in the kind of the spending power, if you like, of the tourist and the local person, the the if the effect of the tourist is the impact is powerful, and the capacity for transforming that culture and that society is also enormous, and therefore the resentment is also something that is you know quite palpable, quite real. Whereas if you see tourists in London, at most it will be the crowds in the way, and that's it. Otherwise, it's just money for those people who run such hospitality events or hotels or whatever. But in a small place, it has much more impact. And this is what causes the resentment, I think. And um, And they're often, NGOs also are also blessed with big cars and nice places to stay. And people wonder sometimes, why do we need them? What are they here to do? They are here often to do something quite useful, but not always. When it comes to some of the health projects, some of the educational projects, etc. But not all of it is as it looks.
Right, right. Uh, Now, switching on to a more general question about your career. I believe you were one of the first writers, or one of the first prominent writers in the UK, to speak out against the practice of glossaries in glossaries used by publishers to quote unquote explain words that are not from English, etc. And you were not in favor of this, and you laid out a clear reasoning why you wanted it to be that way. You said that it made the foreign more foreign, something to that effect. But at the same time, this is something that as a practice has been growing in prominence in recent years. And I know that writers like Salman Rushdie, who you have worked so extensively, you've taught him in the classroom, you've edited a book of essays on Rushdie's work. Rushdie doesn't do glossaries, but he does explain words on the same page very often, right? Which is a kind of middle ground, I suppose. Uh, so, what do you feel about this topic now that 20, 30 years have passed since you first spoke and wrote about this?
He did not make as big a fuss as you suggest about it. What I did was I just said I think it was when we came to Paradise. I said it's not necessary to do this um, because if you put italics, what you're doing is you're drawing attention to to the difference as well, to the foreignness of a word, which is already foreign. And it kind of subverts the reason for having that word there in the first place. Because why put in a word? Why do I put in a word or a phrase like that? Um, well, firstly, because sometimes there isn't the exact equivalent in English, but the sense of it is clear. I make sure that the sense of it is clear. Um, Secondly, because we're kind of establishing a context. This is not happening in Tunbridge Wells. This is happening somewhere else where people speak a different language. So it reminds the reader, in a sense, that these are people actually speaking in a different language, and these are people living in a different place. So, but not exoticizing it by saying this is a foreign word. This is not a foreign word to them. It's a word that they're using. This is a society where different languages are spoken. It's a multilingual, multi-religious, multicultural place. And so different words circulate in this way. So it's for reasons like that that I think leave it like that. We understand that. I don't want a word italicized if I'm reading a book that mentions, I don't know, something to do with a brazier or something to do with a curtain and so on. I don't want these words italicized all the time to draw attention. Let the reader just immerse themselves in the narrative.
Right. Uh, you know, in the novel Theft, a lot of the times when we are talking and listening to we are listening to these characters voice their aspirations. And in so many cases, the aspirations are kind of tied up thematically or metaphorically with the aspirations of, the nascent nation. Uh, what do you think happens to generations like the one that Kareem and Fawzia belong to, where so much of their young lives are spent in quote unquote nation building? How do you think that changes them? And I think we have seen that with India also, people who grew up in the 50s and 60s right after independence. So I was curious what you think about this.
I think in the first place, it offers them opportunities. It suggests that there are choices, there are ways in which they can choose where to go. Uh, and one reason for that is because this is a post-colonial society. This is a societies where opportunities have occurred when they would not have been there before. The choices would have been very clear before. You work for the government as some kind of civil servant, or become a teacher, or this or that. There are a limited number of outlets. I think now, in places, not everywhere, of course, But in places where the society is opening up, there are opportunities, there are ways of thinking more dramatically about what I will do with myself, not just a profession, perhaps a business, or perhaps even to go and work in another country to gain experience or whatever it might be. So I think that generation is benefiting from the way that the world has changed in the last 30, 40 years or so. That doesn't mean that everything's okay, though. I'm not saying that, but it has opened up possibilities for those who are lucky enough to have the qualifications.
Right. Now, Professor Gurnah, you've been a supporter of boycotting Israeli cultural institutions, BDS movement, and all of that. A stance that I fully agree with, by the way, before I ask you this question. But since I am interviewing you, I have to play devil's advocate every now and then. So I would ask you, what would you say to a student who approaches you and says, Professor Gurnah, I really like reading Amos Oz, I really like reading Edgar Keret and all these, Israeli writers. Why should I stop doing that, or why should I stop supporting them?
I have not said I've stopped
Or
reading
like,
anybody.
given that these people are, publishing in Israel and appear in Israeli literature festivals, etc.
No, I have not said stop reading Israeli, whatever. I have not said anything. I have added my name to those who have said we do not wish to have our work published in Israel. So far as I'm concerned, and there's so many injustices taking place, and I would rather not have not participate in the activities of that state. I read Amos Oz and I read all those other things. I'm not saying don't read.
Right.
Uh, and I'm not saying have nothing to do with them. This is to show solidarity with those other people, some of them writers, some of them readers, who are saying there is something unjust going on, and we are showing our disgust at the way in which this state is um, carrying out all these cruelties.
Right.
And one way of doing that is to say, we do not want to have any dealings with you. And so I'm joining in solidarity with those who are saying that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. While reading this book, and it is set in the 1990s, which was a period of great transition, both economically and politically around the world. Uh, how do you feel that the ways in which the global economy was opening up in parts of the world that it had not up until that point? How do you feel that changes people at a moral level, especially in, as you say, post-colonial societies?
But it depends on where you are standing when it begins. So, like India has benefited enormously. Not all of India. India is a huge population, and not everybody has benefited. Uh, but it has benefited so that it has been able as a nation to advance enormously in these last decades. Not everybody was in the right place where that happened. Not everybody was in a position to participate in this opening up. Some of them found themselves in a position where they've become even more oppressed economically than they were before, more dependent economically than they were before. So not everybody has benefited. But I guess what it means is, sorry to interrupt myself, but which is why, of course, you have these huge numbers of people from different parts of Africa trying to find employment or prosperity elsewhere in Europe, in the Middle East, etc., because their societies are depressed, unemployment, lack of investment, and so on. So not everybody has gained. But what has been possible is where it's been allowed, people have found work elsewhere. If you travel to the Middle East, or if you travel certainly to the Gulf areas, you'll find enormous numbers of people, both from your part of the world, but also from Africa, who have found opportunities there. The same is true of those who've been able to find their way into Europe. So even if economies are struggling at home, the larger prosperity in the world has opened up possibilities. Unfortunately, it has also opened up hostilities and angers and all kinds of refusals and of course fatalities and suffering for people who are trying to find a way to this new prosperity. I don't think it's been good for everybody.
Right, right. Sir, so much of your work has involved, African characters trying to craft a new, or trying to get in touch with their own identities, their cultural roots, while at the same time trying to carve out a space for themselves in the Western world, wherever that might be. What I wanted to ask you was, where do you see the limitations and where do you see the advantages of a kind of pan-African identity for these characters outside, outside of Africa in the Western world? I
Mm.
was thinking in particular of books like, say, Afropian, which is something I read last year by Johnny Pitts, in which he sort of explores what it means to be an African in Europe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's nothing new. We have to understand uh, the movements of people uh, to move from wherever it's Africa or India or China or wherever to other places. This is not a new phenomenon in human history. Indeed, the other way around too, Europeans going and taking over all sorts of places in the world. Those experiences have a certain similarity, except for the fact that many of those who are making the move now into Europe from Africa are doing so from a position of relative weakness compared, let's say, with the state-supported movements of people, say, to Australia or to Canada or South America or whatever. And so the burden that they have to cope with is, uh, if you like, a proletarian one in which they have to go and uh, either learn new skills or perhaps even downgrade their skills in order to be able to find employment, to find work, and to improve their lives. And many of them do improve their lives and improve the lives of their families and etc. and so on. It's not, there is an element of tragedy in these movements. But there is also an element of dynamism and opportunity. And it's not just about football, that's either. It's not just about people making good because they have particular talents. I'm also talking about the way in which people of relatively, ordinary talents, as it were, make lives and for themselves and for their families and so on. I don't know whether it's anything unique about Africans having to do this. I think the experience of being a stranger in another culture is probably not kind of like regionally uh, unique. Of course, people from some societies historically have more experience of doing this, have more connections, have better ways of seeking support from already existing communities. Um, it may also be the receiving society has its own prejudices and it prefers this kind of migrant to that kind of migrant. All of these are complications. For Africans, all of them work against them on the whole.
Right, right. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today, Professor.
Thank you very much.